Okay. Joseph, let's start. Okay, my name is Mick Napier, and I'm speaking on behalf of Stop the JNF UK. And the other person you can see is Joseph Schechla, who's speaking from Cairo. Joseph is coordinator of the Housing and Land Rights Network of the Habitat International Coalition. Joseph, can you explain, before we proceed, what that is? I looked up the internet, and I saw that the Housing and Land Rights Network is headquartered in Santiago, Chile. I saw that it's also got a very active base in India, but perhaps you could just explain briefly what that organization is.
Actually, the Habitat International Coalition, which is our umbrella, was established 44 years ago at the first UN conference in Vancouver on housing and human settlements, the Habitat 1. And out of that came a policy known as the Habitat Agenda, which then gets renewed every 20 years. We're now in our third phase of that global agenda with the 2016 New Urban Agenda. And our whole impetus and our sort of existence and our name are linked to that Habitat Agenda. And our purpose has been really to see the implementation and the further development of that agenda. Within the coalition, the Housing and Land Rights Network, which is registered in Geneva, but we're operating also in Cairo. It's part of that larger coalition. The coalition used to be based in Santiago, but it's currently operating the secretariat in Barcelona, and it will change again this year. It changes to a different center in the south, at least every 10 years. So we're undergoing that process now, but we're consistent in upholding the Habitat Agenda. And what we found in the process was that the principles of the housing and land rights in that agenda apply specifically or especially to cases like Palestine, big global cases where housing and land rights violations actually rise to the level of denying self-determination. So part of our work has been actually to understand how that works on a comparative basis, rooted in comparative analysis that some of us have been engaged in for many years, starting with the anti-apartheid movement in Southern Africa, indigenous people's rights. And then when I was looking for a coalition of organizations who could deal with land confiscation and house demolitions on both sides of the Green Line, it was Habitat International Coalition that embraced that challenge, where a lot of Palestine solidarity groups would not do that because they were following the PLO line of West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem as being the only self-determination unit of the Palestinian people, while the same violations were happening against that same indigenous people on the other side of the Green Line. So I've been with the Habitat International Coalition since that relationship started in 1989. And it still remains a very important part of our work, especially working with Palestinian NGOs all over historic Palestine.
So to bring this to the Jewish National Fund, the racist JNF, you start off then with the understanding that ethnic cleansing, violently or bureaucratically dispossessing people of their traditional lands takes place across every sector of Palestine, which is controlled by the Israeli military or civil authority, yeah?
Absolutely, yes. It's the principal raison d'etat, the real purpose of the state. is to acquire Palestinian properties and essentially deny self-determination or even the national existence of the Palestinian people as such. So it has its roots in other examples, not least of which was the British occupation of Ireland 100 years before white settlers came to North America. Of course, that process in North America continued in a very similar way, and the religious justifications for the same kinds of dispossession are at the root of apartheid in South Africa and the development of the various...
So you've noticed that when Spaniards or Brits or Scots in Ireland turn up with a Bible in hand, usually the aim is to dispossess the natives of the best land, and the religious justification gets cooked up, yeah?
Absolutely, and that's precisely what these organizations have done, the Jewish National Fund and others, is to create a kind of a religious nationalism and religious nationality that makes those adherents to Jewish nationality the sole beneficiaries of all that is acquired at the expense of the Palestinian people.
So a lot of people who don't know any better, Joseph, they think that turning up with a real estate deal from a deity, they think it's uniquely Israeli. But some people seem to turn up with title deeds in holy books in many, many parts of the world, do they not? There's nothing special about the Israelis in that respect, is there?
No, there's nothing that special, but it's especially virulent when it's merged with a religious ideology and of course attributed to the will of the divine that this land be given to the colonizer. And that was the case of the English rhetoric in Ireland more than 500 years ago. It was the rhetoric also of the English settlers, the white settlers in general in North America, who used the Bible and called themselves the New Israelites as a way to usher in the reenactment of the ahistoric process of Genesis, eliminating the indigenous people and smiting them and expelling them from the land. So actually the concept of Israel, the sacrament of Israel, is so much a part of the fabric of North American, especially US society, that makes the modern state of Israel just a kind of a latter-day expression of that same momentous genocide that has taken place in other parts of the world.
Joseph, let's proceed quickly, if I may, to, bear with me a second. I'm going to share a screen here from a presentation that you've given before, and you mentioned this in a talk you gave recently. Yes. But these are behaviors, activities which are completely contrary to any notion of international law, and you say they are core behaviors of the Israeli state. Before we proceed to the JNF, could you develop that point?
Well, this is not the entire repertoire of forbidden behaviors, but in current international law, these are acts or activities of a state that are prohibited either by treaty, by peremptory norms, by general principles, and some of them are actually either gross violations or codified as crimes. Torture, apartheid, forced eviction is a gross violation. Population transfer is a serious crime prosecuted at Nuremberg in Tokyo. and prohibited in the Rome Statute. Cross-border harm, this is in general principles. There's a liability on the part of the state causing cross-border harm. But racial discrimination is a general principle of international law, peremptory norm. Self-determination is also a peremptory norm. And all states, whether they're members of the UN or treaty parties under any particular agreement, all states must take actions to remedy or to bring an end to the illegal occupation or the illegal situation of denying self-determination or the practice of racial discrimination. But in this inventory, this illustrative list of prohibited actions, these are 13, 9 of which are actually the core program of the Jewish National Fund: the practice of apartheid, the practice of forced evictions, the serious crime of population transfer, racial discrimination, of course defined as Jewish nationality and against all those who don't fit that description, demographic manipulation inside the state of Israel, denial of self-determination, wanton destruction of property, diversion of funds for colonization, and also especially this is a principle of general principle of international law. Those institutions like the JNF and the World Zionist Organization, they also demand allegiance from or impose nationality obligations on citizens of other states. And this is a violation of the rights of states vis-a-vis each other. But these are also core program features of the Jewish National Fund.
Joseph, before we move on to the other crimes, that last one, the Jewish National Fund has, used to have collection boxes in Jewish homes around the world, in Edinburgh and Glasgow and Vancouver and so on and so on. Now, they couldn't be said at that time to be kind of forcing Israeli nationality on unwilling Jews. But now it seems our governments are dividing Jews into good Jews and bad Jews. Jeremy Corbyn, for example, met his fate because he met with the wrong type of Jews, i.e. those who did not want Israeli nationality or were anti-Zionist. Is there a sense in which that last aspect, which you say is contrary to international law, is that criminality is now being endorsed by our elites? Certainly here in Britain, very much supporting the ethos of the JNF that yes, the Jews that we should listen to are those who support the state of Israel, and those who don't are, really should be pushed into, beyond the margins.
Yes, well, the Jewish National Fund and the other para-statal institutions, the Zionist institutions of the state of Israel, have really institutionalized or formalized, systematized, and promoted this sense of obligation toward Israel on the part of people of Jewish faith. But those Jewish adherents who are anti-Zionist, who don't accept Judaism or Jewishness as a nationality, they are the time-honored, backbone of the emancipationist movement of persons of Jewish faith across Europe, from the time of Moses Mendelssohn through the great scholars of Julius Wellhausen, Nelson Glick, all of the Elmer Berger, who died in the 1990s. This was
come on, don't forget a certain Karl Marx and Rosa Luxemburg, yeah?
Well, yes, these were not religious people.
Oh, I see.
Karl's father had already become a Lutheran evangelical.
Now, I didn't realize you were concentrating on religious Jews.
I mean the practitioner, devout Jewish followers, adherents, and I mentioned Elmer Berger, who was a rabbi, and of course Nelson Glick, who was a student of Julius Wellhausen at Göttingen and formed the Hebrew Union College. These were rabbis who insisted in this emancipationist movement that Jewish people, adherents, should be equal citizens in the countries in which they live. They never had an affiliation with Palestine, not in any historic sense. Their roots were not in the region. And those in North Africa, for example, whose roots are in the Amazigh Berber people, were not at all linked whatsoever to Palestine. And most of the Jewish communities in the Mediterranean in the Hellenic period, in the Hellenistic period, were never affiliated with Palestine. So this attempt to fuse Judaism with a particular place and a particular nationality, even a defunct nationality, these were not the ways to achieve emancipation in the Western countries. So those who affiliated themselves with Judaism as an ethical and moral construct, not and clearly not a nationality, these were the mainstream of Judaism. And this is why, in fact, in the development of these institutions, the World Zionist Organization being the first in 1897, closely followed by the establishment of the Jewish National Fund, the World Zionist Organization didn't have much appeal because the name Zionism, Zionist, did not appeal to the majority of Jews. But the Jewish National Fund is something identifiably Jewish and therefore is not as controversial in its title and in its perceived objectives as the World Zionist Organization. So the Jewish National Fund became more acceptable, and as you noted, collection boxes in homes of people who grew up for generations now, believing that it was their duty to contribute money to this Jewish cause. It wasn't a Jewish cause at all. It was a Zionist cause, which left, in fact, a lot of emancipationist Jews feeling, well, cheated, deceived, and part of a wholly illegal colonization movement, the fruits of which we've seen, the rotten fruits, of course, we've seen today.
The Jewish National Fund, we wish to challenge the JNF. We've been successfully challenging the JNF in different ways, some successes in Canada, some successes elsewhere. What would you say is the fundamental argument? You say that in South Africa, it was the pass laws, which were the mechanism for enforcing the full the full brutality of South African apartheid. But you're saying Jewish nationality is the basis for restricting access or controlling access to the resources of the state and the society. Can you develop that point fully?
Actually, John Dugard, who has provided us with the anatomy of apartheid in Southern Africa, has described that it was actually the Population Registry Act before the pass laws, but the Population Registry Act as the linchpin of apartheid, because that established the categories of people in South Africa according to skin color. and their corresponding rights and privileges. By analogy, in Israeli law, it's Jewish nationality that is that linchpin. It creates the criterion by which citizens or even non-citizens, citizens of foreign countries who are persons of Jewish faith, are considered to be Jewish nationals and eligible for a whole slate of economic, social, and cultural rights that are implicitly, not explicitly, but implicitly denied to anyone else. What this means for the Palestinian people is that they do not have rights to land, to culture, to heritage, to self-determination, to water. These are rights and privileges that are reserved only for those having what's called Jewish nationality.
Now, a Catalan person once told me that the only place he could or she could legally be Catalan was in Israel, on the basis that there are over 100 nationalities, so-called nationalities, recognized by Israel for the purpose of identity cards. I mean, Jewish is the main one. That opens the door to all sorts of things. But there are literally over 100 other ones to maintain the fiction of the reality of nationality. Can you go into that?
Yes, well, this is actually another smokescreen, part of the, by way of deception that Zionism operates. In fact, the State of Israel has reported to the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This is an official legal document identifying Israel's performance of treaties, saying that the Ministry of Interior recognizes 107 nationalities, and therefore the state can, by definition, cannot be racist, but in fact is multi-ethnic. However, it's only Jewish nationality that is the status affording economic, social, and cultural rights, and even some civil and political rights to people, to persons in Israel or in the territories of Israeli control. Even the High Court twice, once in 1971, and once again in 2013. The High Court of Israel has found that, quote, there is no nationality in Israel other than Jewish nationality. It's only Jewish nationality that is recognized as a civil status in Israel. There is no such thing as Israeli nationality inside Israel. There is such a thing as Israeli citizenship, which is accessible by 4 different means: birth, residency, marriage, or immigration. But immigration to achieve Jewish nationality is available only to achieve, Israeli citizenship and Jewish nationality is only available to children of a Jewish mother.
Now, if you go on to the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel, there'll be a page there on how you can apply for Israeli nationality, quote unquote. But yes, that's a complete lie and a con, isn't it? Because that status is specifically prohibited to any Israeli citizen.
In fact, if you go to the laws of the State of Israel, in their English, official English translation, you will find the law of nationality. But this is a mistranslation, because the term in Hebrew in that law is not nationality at all. It's ezrohut, which means citizenship. That law can only provide for the acquisition of Israeli citizenship, but never anything called Israeli nationality. The High Court has rejected twice this assertion that there is something called Israeli nationality. Israeli citizenship is the proper term. It's ezrohut Israeli, but the other term is leum Yahudi, which is, of course, Jewish nationality. There's no such thing as Israeli nationality whatsoever, except in the minds of those people who have been trained in law, who understand that when a citizen of a country crosses a border, they're recognized for the nationality in the name of their home state. But in Israel, there's no such thing as Israeli nationality. It doesn't exist.
Okay, if we're taking on the JNF, they wish to be, on the one hand, an Israeli para-statal. On the other hand, they wish to claim that they're not responsible for the crimes of the state of Israel. Why have they got away with this for so long? And what would be your tactical advice on how to deal with this in a co-legal campaign, Joseph?
Well, a legal campaign also has been tried successfully, and I would refer to that strategy as a proven method to clarify this, this situation. The American Council for Judaism, which was essentially an NGO made up of prominent rabbis in Canada and the United States. In the 1960s, in 1968, in fact, well, earlier than that, raised a case with the US State Department challenging the concept of Jewish nationality that's extended and claimed and exercised by these parastatal institutions within the jurisdiction of the United States. And a legal finding of the State Department in 1964, I believe, was that there is no such thing as Jewish nationality as a concept of international law, that citizens are the citizens of their countries, and in the United States, there is no distinction between the status of a person as an adherent to one religion or another. So this is an anti-democratic principle, this Jewish nationality. And in the course of that, or in the follow-up to that, the American Council for Judaism took up a challenge within the 9th District of the US Superior Court in Washington, D.C., suing or petitioning the Treasury Department to force the World Zionist Organization to register as a foreign agent, where it was registered as a tax-exempt charity before, claiming to be an NGO and operating for charitable purposes. The court found that, in fact, and the same could be applied to the JNF for the very same reasons of law, is actually operating at the behest of the State of Israel. These institutions are linked to the State of Israel by two fundamental laws. One is the Zionist Covenant, that is the covenant of the Zionist executive that links the World Zionist Organization and Jewish Agency to the State of Israel, and also the Jewish National Fund under the Karen Kayemet LeIsrael law of 1953, that where Israel recognizes that the Jewish National Fund is part of the State of Israel. And also the Articles of Incorporation of the Jewish National Fund note that upon its dissolution, its assets would revert to the government of Israel. These are para-statal institutions. They are not doing charitable work. They are not non-governmental by any stretch of the imagination. And therefore the Ninth Circuit, the Circuit of the U.S. Superior Court in 1970 found that the World Zionist Organization was not a charitable non-governmental organization, but actually an appendage of the State of Israel operating deceptively as a charity. Jewish National Fund can be challenged in the very same way. What happened to the World Zionist Organization as a result of this 1970s decision was that it re-registered under a slightly different set of articles, calling itself the Organization of Organizations. But the JNF was never similarly challenged. And the World Zionist Organization case, if that were to be mounted today, it would be a very expensive undertaking to take on these institutions in national courts of law. But they are operating on very shaky ground, because in legal fact, they are appendages of the State of Israel, not non-governmental. They're operating in a sui generis position, taking tax-exempt contributions and diverting them to carry out the serious crime of population transfer.
So we want to disclose the reality that these are agents of the Israeli state, that the snipers who are mowing down Palestinians on the Gaza periphery, they're agents of the Israeli state in uniform. Other agents of the Israeli state and the Division of Labor are charged functions, prettifying Israel, trying to present it as progressive and so on and so on. And the JNF is also an agent. But how do we avoid the danger that saying that Jews were rootless cosmopolitans, saying that they're not loyal to the state? By the way, I don't feel any loyalty to the British state at all. So, but how do we avoid using some of the language of the anti-Semites when we take on the JNF and other Israeli para-statals? I think we have to do it, but how do we avoid that dark shadow?
Well, the dark shadow is these institutions. They are operating in the name of Jews. This is part of the whole construct that should, first of all, concern persons of Jewish faith or identity, as well as others, because actually the charters of these institutions themselves reveal and stand for a whole set of problems that I think we can all agree on, and that is the reversion to a racist classification of Jews, as done, of course, in the articles of the Memorandum of Establishment of the Jewish National Fund, that is recognizing Jews as as the beneficiaries of the JNF are those of Jewish race or descendancy. The claim to act on behalf of all persons of Jewish faith, imposing Jewish nationality on citizens of other countries and treating them as such, and calling for their expression of allegiance through money and other political activities. These organizations are established and chartered providing a legal basis, legalized, I'd say, basis for institutional discrimination in Israel and Israel-controlled territories. And they were carrying out codified war crimes and crimes against humanity as a matter of their principal program and central purpose. And that is the dispossession of the indigenous Palestinian people and the transfer of their properties to the only beneficiaries of the JNF, that is, in their words, persons of Jewish race or descendancy. And then, of course, there's the further question of other contraventions of international human rights, humanitarian and criminal law, and of course the deceptive and illegal practice of falsifying a tax-exempt charity status in more than 50 countries while operating as agents of a foreign state.
Can you discuss this diagram here?
Okay, yes.
The JNF in the matrix of para-statals and its particular relationship to these other two major Zionist para-statal organizations.
Yes. Well, a bit of history is important here too, because as I said, the World Zionist Organization it didn't sell very well. It didn't travel very well. The ideological objective of Zionism was not common among people of Jewish faith. It certainly was attractive to those entrepreneurs who had this colonial vision, and also those who wanted to eliminate Jews from Europe. And so the 1897 established WZO had to adapt and adopt another personality, and that is in the name of the Jewish Agency. Jewish Agency is a sister organization. It has the same executive committee as the World Zionist Organization. It just operates under a less ideological name and a less assailable name for Jews who could easily support a Jewish agency. That sounds kind of progressive, even though they didn't adhere to Zionism. And then that was established in 1921. It took a long time for the World Zionist Organization to adapt and to come up with this alter ego called the Jewish Agency. But the Jewish National Fund from 1901 was the funnel for resources to the World Zionist Organization, to the colonies, to the Yishuv, the colonizing Palestine, and to the Jewish Agency. But here again is the important outcome of that challenge in the United States to the World Zionist Organization. The court found that the World Zionist Organization represented the State of Israel and could not be considered a charitable, tax-exempt entity. In the Fourth Zionist Congress in 1970, or was it 71? But the Zionist executive came up with a resolution that clarified that the Jewish Agency will operate in Israel. So that would be less controversial, being a Jewish agency operating in Israel, than a World Zionist Organization, which was now, after 1971, operating exclusively in occupied territories that were not considered part of the State of Israel. So this is why the World Zionist Organization's settlement department is so powerful in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in the Golan Heights. The Jewish Agency is the primary face of this colonization process and entity inside the Green Line. But the Jewish National Fund resources both of them. It is the Jewish National Fund that is supporting colonies in the West Bank and in the Golan. It is the Jewish National Fund that is calling for, well, that is actually carrying out the demolition of villages in the Naqab, in the southern part of historic Palestine. Certainly you all have heard of the infamous village of Al-Araqib that has been demolished more than 173 times, according to my last count. So the Jewish National Fund is operating all over the place. The Jewish National Fund is also responsible for these apparently green activities of planting trees, which has always been a way of upholstering over the ethnic cleansing, the demolished villages in Palestine, but also operating in the occupied territories as well. So Jewish National Fund has no compunctions about dispossession, environmental destruction, colonization, population transfer in any territory that is controlled by Israel. But the Jewish Agency and the World Zionist Organization have established this kind of apparent or putative division of labor since they were caught red-handed operating as a charitable institution while representing the state of Israel in the United States.
I mean, we've seen the JN aimlessly put their flags on the bulldozers leveling Al-Araqib.
Yes.
So that can be. But can I just check? If we were to follow the Benjamins, would we see a trail from the JNF to the Jewish Agency, such
Yes.
that anything the Jewish Agency does can be connected to a critique, a campaign against the JNF? Can we be confident of that, Joseph?
Yes, it requires, of course, following the money, but that is not impossible. Where the JNF has actually engaged in joint operations with the Jewish Agency and or the World Zionist Organization, it's clear. And this has been sort of exemplified, I would say, in the in the 80s, 90s, and particularly when Ariel Sharon was Minister of Housing, which in our field of habitat and housing, this is a very powerful instrument of state housing. And it's no surprise that Ariel Sharon, an army general, would be also the housing minister. But in those years, Israel was establishing colonies like Modi'in, right on the Green Line, so that there was all kinds of ambiguity about whether or not this was construction of a colony in Israel and or in the occupied territories. Well, it was the Jewish National Fund and its resources that were able to operate without any compunctions that the World Zionist Organization or Jewish Agency had to divide labor according to territory. So in these cases, the Jewish National Fund engaged with those settlement construction, those colony constructions, but it continues to do the same unchallenged in operation with the World Zionist Organization in the occupied territories and the Jewish Agency in places like Al-Araqib inside the Green Line.
Joseph, bear with me a second. Sorry, got to share this screen if I may. So the JNF spans these various different countries.
Yes.
I believe it's 44, 45 countries they have offices. Sometimes it's a general office in the Balkans or something like this. So we want to
Yes.
challenge them. And we're working with Palestinian partners to present a case that this individual family has been, its property has been pillaged, they've been violated.
Yeah.
It's part of the wider Palestinian story, and it's always told in that way. But what would be your advice on how to challenge the JNF in these different legal jurisdictions around the world? For example, a Palestinian family determined to fight the JNF for, without prejudice to the right of return, but to fight the JNF for damages for what's been done to them. How can we, what would your advice be on how to pursue a politico-legal campaign against them in these jurisdictions?
Well, there are two issues here. One is the illegal operation of the JNF in all of these countries, 20% of the world's countries. Illegal because they're operating as a charity while actually operating as part of the state of Israel. That's anathema. That could be one challenge. But for particular victims, they would, well, they should sue for reparations, which is beyond compensation. Compensation is just one of 7 elements of reparation. But primary among these is restitution, that is return of their property, the status before the crime or violation was committed, compensation for those things that can't be subject to restitution, promises of non-repetition of the crime, and of course the satisfaction of the victim. And that should be the objective of any plaintiff who would charge against the JNF its violation of both domestic and international law in carrying out its dispossession, destruction, and population transfer activities targeting them. In a Canadian jurisdiction, it would be possible to raise this in a court that recognizes. We know that in Canada, judges have not been very open to recognizing the jurisdiction of their courts dealing with international matters. The same has been true in the United States. However, the law is definitely on the plaintiff's side. And I would suggest that all of these methods need to be applied. That is the illegal nature of the operation of the JNF as such, posing as a tax-exempt charitable institution, and also with the track that it has caused measurable harm against plaintiffs. Besides just its violation of the state in which it operates. To my mind, it's a two-prong legal pursuit. Of course, I'm not a lawyer in those jurisdictions, so it requires, of course, specificity from the legal experts there. But there are two kinds of violation taking place here. It's the material consequences to the plaintiffs or the natural persons who are subject to the entitlements of reparation, and also the violation of the state itself by the deceptive operation of the JNF as a charity, getting away with these kinds of crimes as if they were charitable acts.
So the first thing to insist and assert on to win legally going down that legal road, is that the JNF is an agency of the Israeli state and acts to further Israeli state policy. Then the issue of reparations follows on from that.
Yes.
Because and only possible if the JNF is seen as an agent of that state. Is that right?
I could see these two tracks being pursued separately, depending on who is the judge, the jurisdiction, whether there's a plaintiff within that jurisdiction. But the arguments are really twofold. That the illegalities of the JNF operation are twofold. The harm that it does outright, and of course the deception of its registration in those 44 countries.
The legal road, I think, really should not be dismissed out of hand, even though we have a Home Secretary here in Britain, Priti Patel, who wanted to send humanitarian aid to the Israeli army. That's a fact. But I recall that Tzipi Livni came here on one occasion and had to speak at a JNF meeting in London, and had to call off because there was a serious threat that an arrest warrant had been issued for her by a London sheriff. So despite the complicity of the top levels of government, some legal camp are possible with the lower levels. Yeah.
Yes, it's difficult to extricate the persons from the organization. I think that in the case of Tzipi Livni, she was being pursued not because of her affiliation with JNF, but because of her criminality as an individual. However, this is a very symbolic occasion when you have this type of person who is indicted for international crimes, actually operating as a promoter or cheerleader for the JNF. It rather exposes the JNF to the kind of scrutiny that would ultimately uncover the dual violations that the JNF is responsible for.
No, I was thinking more simply of the fact that a legal campaign backed up by popular support can be effective. I mean, in a different time, if you remember, General Pinochet actually was subjected to house arrest in Britain, despite dining regularly with Maggie Thatcher. I'm just saying there are openings perhaps there are openings if we know how to find them.
Yes.
Can I raise another couple of legal issues and ask for your opinion? A very wealthy American had bought a painting which later turned out to have been pillaged from its Jewish owners during the war by the Nazis. And the court, I think in France, found that it wasn't key that this fellow had bought the painting in good faith. It remained the property of the family of the Jewish owner who had been murdered by the Nazis.
Yes.
And the court ordered its return to that family. Now that's 10 years before 1948. Surely not surely, might that have some influence in attempts to raise the issue of the pillage of Palestinian property in civil actions in the West? And the other example, if I may, there's a bunch of German Jews who were not Zionists, but they decided to become farmers in the 30s, and they bought some farms and farm cottages and set up as farmers in some part of Eastern Germany. The Nazis murdered all of them and then sold the proceeds to Germans who were unaware of where it had come from. Now that's farmland. German courts have recently ruled that the owners the farms, the right to ownership of the previous Jewish owners has to be recognized. Is that a direct part of the Palestinian right for their property to be returned?
Absolutely, these are very important precedents. They also align with the general principle in international law, and also the subject of an international treaty that, okay, Israel is not a party to it, but the non-applicability of a statute of limitations on war crimes and crimes against humanity. That is generally understood by the courts to mean that the rights that have been infringed are not extinguished by the transfer of property, whether it's transferred to the JNF or even the JNF's further transfer to another individual, or the death of the actual property holder or the right holder. The same is true for refugees, and this is what a lot of refugees, including and especially Palestinian refugees, don't understand well enough, and that is that their rights are not just return and or compensation, but that they're much broader than that. The right is a right to reparation, and that those rights are not extinguished with the death of the title holder. So there is no statute of limitations on these kinds of crimes. And that is generally the case whether or not the state of the jurisdiction is a member or is a party to the treaty on the non-applicability of statute of limitations in case of these crimes.
Joseph, I've got a question before I ask you to make some concluding remarks. It's a question from Max. I've got a couple of questions if it's okay. Can you discuss the JNF strategy? You know, the JNF is sending some funds, it seems, to decent activities, for cancer research, to LGBTQ groups, green energy, and so on. Is this then feeling the pressure of campaigns internationally and the need to have more smoke to conceal what they're doing?
Well, yes, and I think that this also maybe raises the other strategic question beyond law, and that is the court of public opinion. But also, I think when addressing these seeming contradictions, it's really important for us in the public sphere to keep in mind what are state obligations. As an agent, as an institution doing the work of government, public activities, the JNF has certain obligations. It's not obliged to give money to an LGBTQ organization or engage in cancer research, but it is obliged to refrain from the commission of crimes. And while it's welcome if any party actually fulfills a charitable purpose, well, charity is inferior to sustainable development, but let's just say a good doer deed is always welcome. But the JNF is not a good doer, a do-gooder. It has obligations that it is violating, and those are the ones that are causing harm. So whitewashing or pinkwashing or greenwashing JNF, as it often tries to do, these are not sufficient to evade or to avoid the obligations that it bears to refrain from these prohibited acts that are dispossessing the Palestinian people, denying their self-determination, diverting money to criminal activities, engaging in population transfer. If we know what the obligations are, whether it's in the court of law or in the court of public opinion, that knowledge is sufficient to mount a successful strategy to clarify the contradictions and seek remedy.
Joseph, a question from Annie. If we look at those jurisdictions around the world, are there any that might be particularly prone to sympathise with human rights litigation against the JNF? Is there anywhere we might hope to get more hope than perhaps in the UK under Priti Patel? Any suggestions as to where the first couple of victories might be achieved?
In state jurisdictions, in these cases, it's often affected by politics and the selection of judges, and that kind of crapshoot of taking a case to a court of law. But what we need, in fact, is to develop more, also in the BDS discourse, the obligations of states and the obligations not just of central institutions of the state, but of all organs of the state under international law obligations. So what has been done at the municipal level, for example, is very promising, resulting in BDS or apartheid-free zone resolutions of municipalities. But what has happened with those, like in Canada, in Europe, but particularly in Spain, where it's been really advanced, the challenge has been against the authority of the municipalities to engage in these foreign adventures, foreign policy issues, before the administrative courts. The administrative courts don't deal with state obligations, they don't deal with international law. The BDS movement has been focused mostly on the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, as an unassailable, inalienable right, protecting the boycott. What we need is actually a discourse that identifies where are the obligations of the state to bring an end to the illegal situation. If the central governments fail to do that, we have also greater leverage at the local level, where all organs of the state bear the same obligations as the central government in bringing an end to this illegal situation. So I would say there are multiple levels and multiple jurisdictions we can go to, but we need to have more of a developed discourse on what are the human rights obligations extraterritorially of the state, and what are those obligations also of all the organs of the state, whether they're federated states or municipalities. Citizens have the responsibility, if not the obligation, to ensure that their public institutions fulfill the obligations to take effective measures to bring an end to the illegal situation.
Joseph Schechla, it's just after 5 o'clock here in the UK, 6 o'clock where you are in Cairo.
Yeah.
I want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. It's been a pleasure. We first met in Geneva, I think, in 2009, and you were involved from the beginning in the discussions that led to Stop the JNF International. And it's been a pleasure over the years, Joseph, and it's been a great pleasure to renew this cooperation in recent weeks.
Yes, and by the way, in 2009, this was just after the JNF had applied for consultative status to the UN in 2007 as an NGO.
Yes.
And again, the JNF was exposed as not an NGO and not an organization operating consistent with the principles of the UN Charter. So that was a very important moment, I think, in the JNF history. It hasn't tried to do that again, but it very well could. It's also part of their strategy to now not green or pink wash, but to wrap themselves in the blue flag of the UN as if they were somehow an NGO doing development work.
Okay, Joseph, thanks again. We'll keep in touch and we'll continue to struggle against the racist JNF. Joseph Schechla in Cairo, thank you very much indeed. Everyone else, please register for the upcoming webinars by Stop the JNF UK, first Saturday of every month, 4 p.m. UK time. You can find us and keep up the struggle. Thank you all and goodbye.
Goodbye. Thanks.